Welcome to the first video of one of the most important fantasy football series you'll watch all off season long. Volume versus efficiency. I talk about it every off season, and I put together a series of videos to help us answer that question: what is more important, volume or efficiency when it comes to fantasy football? If you're new here, subscribe to the channel. If you've been here and you don't have your bell notifications on, do it right now, because you are not going to want to miss any of these videos over the next couple of weeks that is going to break down volume versus efficiency for the top running backs, wide receivers, and tight ends in fantasy football. Headliner Nation, if you have been around a while, you already know what videos you have stumbled upon. Video number one in my series of volume versus efficiency will be volume monsters at the running back position. And what I have done is I have taken the top 30 running backs in terms of carries last season and broke out several different categories of statistics to help us figure out which running backs get the most overall volume. Not the most carries, but overall total volume. Carries, rushing yards, rushing touchdowns, and many other statistics that we're going to utilize in a formula to tell us what running backs give us the most volume upside for fantasy football. And all these numbers are going to be based off of 2024. Obviously, but it's going to give us an idea heading into 2025 on what we may be able to expect. Again, this series of videos that I do is one of the most popular video series that I do every single offseason. And I believe this is the 4th year now that I have done these. So lock in, hit the like button for me. As we're going through the video, leave questions down below. But the most important thing that you can do right now, outside of listening to everything I've got to cover today, is ordering your 2025 fantasy football draft guide. Right now, it is packed full of rookie and dynasty content. But over the coming weeks, you're going to see a ton of redraft content pop in as well. And for the price that you're paying, it is the best bang for your buck value in all of fantasy football today. You will not pay any less for more information than what we have available to you. And I've been busy working on scouting reports for every single rookie that was drafted in 2025. So get yours right now. Get ahead of the competition, whether you do dynasty, best ball, redraft, it doesn't matter. This draft guide is good for anybody in any type of leagues. Go to the link down below as soon as this video is done, or hit pause and go order yours right now, because you're not going to want to miss out on the information that will make you a fantasy football champion in 2025. We have a lot of categories that we're going to talk about today, but the first one is going to be rushing attempts. Top 6 players in rushing attempts last season, all over 300. Barkley led the way. No shock there. 345 to 325, 20 more carries than Derrick Henry, who is at number 2. And then you got Kyren Williams, Bijan Robinson, Jonathan Taylor, who it's interesting to see up here this high, because for all the talk that people have with him missing games or injury bugs and things like that, he still had over 300 carries last season. Josh Jacobs, his first year in Green Bay, over 300 as well. Kind of that second tier below that, Najee Harris kicks that off at 263. Tony Pollard, 260 in Tennessee. That's a really solid number. And I've talked about Tony Pollard in a couple of videos already, but he is quickly becoming one of my favorite values for 2025 drafts already. Aaron Jones in Minnesota last year. Will he keep that up now that they have Jordan Mason? Jordan Mason actually just squeezed in at the bottom of this list. If he hadn't been injured, he would have been much higher. DeAndre Swift at 253. Jahmyr Gibbs, Chuba Hubbard, each of them tying for 250. Jahmyr Gibbs, because that debate is going to rage on, and he's going to be a guy that we will talk about a lot in this video. But there's people who will look at Jahmyr Gibbs and say, I don't want to use a top 3 or a top 5 pick on him because David Montgomery is going to be there and he's going to be getting a ton of touches as well. I think at the end of this video, though, I'm going to have you all convinced that if you want to invest in Jahmyr Gibbs as a top 3 pick, I will not argue against it at all. Moving forward, Joe Mixon, James Conner. James Conner is also going to come up quite a bit on this list. We'll talk about that as we go on as well. Rico Dowdle, a lot of carries last season. Different setup this year for him. Probably not going to reach 235 again. Chase Brown at 229, and he wasn't even really the starter to begin the season. It took a couple of weeks for him to get going. Alvin Kamara, Breece Hall, Bucky Irving, kind of the same thing. Wasn't the starter at the beginning of the season. Took a few weeks and took over. James Cook. I think a lot of people are going to be shocked at how low James Cook was. James Cook had the same amount of carries last season as Ramondre Stevenson. 207. But there were some things that he did in terms of efficiency and obviously the touchdowns, which will come up as well. Stevenson, Devon Achane, Kareem Hunt, J.K. Dobbins, Tyrone Tracy, Brian Robinson, David Montgomery, who also would have been a lot higher if it had not been for how many games he missed. We'll talk about that at the end of the video. Tank Bigsby made his way into the top 30, Kenneth Walker, and Jordan Mason. So these are the 30 running backs that we will be discussing throughout this video. And we're going to be going through each of these segments and each of these statistics and talking about where these 30 running backs rank in each area. Then at the end of the video, we have a formula that will give us an average score. The lower the score, the better, and we'll see which one of these running backs are the true volume monsters. Who had the most rushing yards last season? Now, we will talk a little bit about kind of the efficiency side, because when you take a look at rushing yards, the efficiency to rushing yards would be yards per average. And that will be coming up in my insane efficiency video about running backs next week. But for now, we're going to be talking about just the pure overall volume, but kind of where people ranked in terms of their attempts compared to their yards. So for instance, 1 and 2 in rushing attempts and rushing yards, Saquon Barkley and Derrick Henry. No surprise there. Number 3 in rushing yards was Bijan Robinson. He was 4th in carries. 4th in rushing yards, Jonathan Taylor. He was 5th in carries. Now, you're going to start seeing kind of a big change here. Number 5 in rushing yards, Jahmyr Gibbs. He was 11th in carries. So when you just take a look at it right now, Jahmyr Gibbs in terms of efficiency was an absolutely solid player, both efficiency and volume. And you can already see that painting start to work its way out. Josh Jacobs was 6th in yards and carries. Kyren Williams had a little bit of a drop. And I think people are going to be talking about Kyren Williams quite a bit heading into this fantasy season. Efficiency-wise, not the greatest. 3rd in carries, 7th in rushing yards. Not a huge drop, not one that overly concerns me, but enough that we know that he has to score touchdowns. And that's what he's going to do in this offense. Sean McVay likes one running back, and it's fine that they've added some guys to this running back room. They've got Blake Corn from last year. They've got Jarquez Hunter now as well. Those guys could definitely help, but Kyren Williams is still going to be the guy. Chuba Hubbard was 11th in carries, just like Jahmyr Gibbs, 8th in rushing yards. So Jahmyr Gibbs, Chuba Hubbard, both already seeing some decent efficiency there to go along with some really solid volume. Now, some of the biggest fallers here that I want to talk about, one of them is Breece Hall. He was 18th in carries. He is 22nd in rushing yards. Efficiency was not all that great last season. Obviously, when you take a look at what that offense was offering, it's no shock that even if they kept trying to feed him the ball, he wasn't doing a whole lot with it. Only 876 receiving yards last year. A guy like DeAndre Swift, kind of the same thing. 10th in carries last year, 18th in yards at 959. What will he look like in Ben Johnson's offense? Now, when Ben Johnson was an offensive coordinator in Detroit, they said goodbye to DeAndre Swift, and they decided to go with David Montgomery and Jahmyr Gibbs instead. Are they going to be doing some things with DeAndre Swift? Are they going to have a rotating backfield? Do they have kind of a 1B to his 1A? Those things are still going to need to play themselves out. Efficiency will be the name of the game with DeAndre Swift, though, and we'll talk about that next week. But volume-wise, we'll kind of go through where DeAndre Swift ranked in terms of volume last season and if we see that getting any better. Guys that were, so everybody over 1,000 rushing yards last season. James Cook was at the fewest with 1,009. And then you had Mixon, Harris, Dowdle, who ended up going over 1,000 yards last year, tied with Tony Pollard at 1,079. James Conner, Bucky Irving, Aaron Jones, Chuba Hubbard, Kyron Williams, Josh Jacobs, Jahmyr Gibbs, JT, Bijan Robinson, Derrick Henry, and Saquon Barkley. All right, let's move on to avoided tackles. And we'll be talking about avoided tackles per attempt when we go into efficiency. But I also wanted to see just overall avoided tackles, who had the most of them last season. It's one of my favorite statistics to take a look at because I love running backs that create second yards or they create second opportunities. They can maximize their ceiling with being able to avoid tackles or break tackles and pick up extra yards. The Derrick Henry hate will happen once again heading into 2025, and it's going to allow you to potentially get Derrick Henry at a discount once again, because for the last 4 seasons, it's been the same thing about Derrick Henry. He's getting older, too much wear and tear, tons of volume the year before, and it hasn't stopped him yet. Derrick Henry is just not human, probably, at this point. He's a different breed of running back than what we've become accustomed to over the last several years. When we're talking about guys like Jonathan Taylor or Christian McCaffrey who are consistently getting hurt, who are consistently missing time, who can't hold up under a ton of volume. Derrick Henry is like an Emmitt Smith. Guys back in the day that were toting the rock over and over and over and over, were not missing games, and were high upside plays year after year. And Derrick Henry last season, 81 avoided tackles, 11 more than Bijan Robinson, who might be one of the slipperiest running backs in all of football, with only 70. Derrick Henry was not just getting a ton of volume last year, but he was doing other things on top of that volume to go with it. Derrick Henry is a beast, and he's going to be again in 2025. And if you're skipping on him because you're worried about his workload and him finally going downhill, I don't know what to tell you, but I'm not skipping on Derrick Henry anytime soon. Bijan Robinson, who are some surprises up here? James Conner at number 3 with 68 avoided tackles. That's a lot. That's a lot of avoided tackles for a guy that really wasn't talked about last year. James Conner, safe, in my opinion, safe RB2. But can he stay healthy? That's number 1, because he's missed quite a few games, 13 games over the last 3 seasons to be exact. And Trey Benson is sitting right behind him. How long before Trey Benson starts to take more? How about Najee Harris? Najee Harris coming in at number 5, tied with Jahmyr Gibbs. Now, the biggest thing here is Jahmyr Gibbs had 63 avoided tackles on 250 rushing attempts, where Najee Harris had 63 avoided tackles on 263 rushing attempts. But one thing about Najee Harris over the course of his career so far is he hasn't been the most efficient running back. He's had a whole lot of volume, but it was nice to see a decent amount of avoided tackles compared to what he had in terms of his overall volume and rushing attempts, because of course the more carries you have, the more likely you are to have more avoided tackles. But to see him kind of on par with Jahmyr Gibbs in that 250 to 263 range and still have the same amount of avoided tackles, that speaks to why, even though I love Omarion Hampton, I don't think Omarion Hampton's just going to take over as the starter right away, and why I think Najee Harris will still be utilized quite a bit in 2025. Saquon Barkley, Kenneth Walker is one guy, him and Bucky Irving right here in number 8 and number 9. Kenneth Walker is one guy who, if he can stay healthy, he could really have a big season because he's going to have a decent amount of volume. But the one thing that we've seen about Kenneth Walker is he does have the potential to have a ton of efficiency to go with it, that he can make people miss these tackles, that he can break tackles, that he can pick up yards after contact, a lot of those different things. So Kenneth Walker has a lot of ability, especially when you take a look at 29th in rushing attempts with 153, but he was 8th in avoided tackles with 61. That's a huge, huge number, and one of the reasons why I'm not willing to give up on Kenneth Walker. Bucky Irving had 19 rushing attempts and 9th in avoided tackles with 57. Now, taking a look here at some guys in terms of Where did they finish in avoided tackles compared to rushing attempts? Jonathan Taylor is one of the guys that concerns me the most. He was 5th in rushing attempts with 303, 25th in avoided tackles with only 36. So just to put that in comparison, Jahmyr Gibbs had 250 carries to Jonathan Taylor's 303. He had 63 avoided tackles to Jonathan Taylor's 36. He may not have that same spring and get up that he had at one point in time. If we're chasing Jonathan Taylor, it's going to be chasing volume for him. But where does that volume land in terms of value when it comes to draft day? Because if you're thinking Jonathan Taylor is a 2nd round pick, maybe, are there other guys going in front of him that will have equal volume? But then after we do the efficiency video, we'll also have really solid efficiency as well. Another name that kind of pops up in the same aspect of that is Tony Pollard. 8th in rushing attempts, but 18th in avoided tackles with 39. And that's one of the reasons why I think Tony Pollard at his value is excellent. Because, yeah, the efficiency may not be great. So he's not going to see a ton of upside, but the volume is going to be really, really solid. And Tony Pollard is going to be drafted as a guy that might be like a low-end RB2, high-end RB3, where Jonathan Taylor, kind of in the same aspect of it, is going to be drafted as an RB1 for your team. So does it make a whole lot of sense to spend a really early draft pick on Jonathan Taylor? Or to take somebody with a little bit higher upside because their efficiency is better early in your draft, and then grab a guy like Tony Pollard much later? Rushing touchdowns. 3 guys led the league last year in rushing touchdowns, each of them finishing with 16. Derrick Henry, Jahmyr Gibbs, James Cook. James Cook, who scores 2, 3, 4 touchdowns a season, comes away with 16 last year. That was a big jump for him, and it was good for him to see because fantasy owners that really like James Cook were finally getting that value that they had been investing in. Last season, we had 11 players with double-digit rushing touchdowns. Obviously, the 3 guys that I just mentioned. 15, Josh Jacobs, tied at 14. Brian Robinson and Kyren Williams. Saquon Barkley had 13. He could have had 20 last season probably if it weren't for the fact that he loses touches at the goal line and inside the 5 to, unfortunately, Jalen Hurts. And we'll talk about that a little bit more with Saquon Barkley as we go. David Montgomery, even though he missed 3 games, he still finished with 12. Joe Mixon, Jonathan Taylor both had 11. And then Chuba Hubbard with 10 rushing touchdowns. Now, when you take a look at the most volume compared to rushing touchdowns, Najee Harris had the most carries with the fewest amount of rushing touchdowns, finished 7th in carries, only had 6 rushing touchdowns. Aaron Jones, Tony Pollard were each very close as well. They both had only 5 rushing touchdowns. Now, Najee Harris and Tony Pollard, both of those made sense because the quarterback situations and really the offense as a whole and kind of how it functioned, number one, would lead to issues just getting into the red zone, but then also scoring from there. So while they had a good amount of volume, their offenses did a pretty poor job of setting them up to score to get those guys goal line carries. Aaron Jones is the one that's a little bit more confusing to me because he finished 9th in carries, but that offense didn't have issues last year. Sam Darnold was very good. You had Jordan Addison. You had Justin Jefferson. TJ Hockenson came back last year. So you had plenty of weapons to move down the field, get into the end zone, and even run the football at times. But we even saw it in that last game of the season against Detroit. They're going to throw the football even at the goal line sometimes. So when you take a look at Aaron Jones, if he is the starter this year over Jordan Mason, who was traded from the San Francisco 49ers to Minnesota, Aaron Jones, is he going to be able to find himself with more than 5 rushing touchdowns? Or is he going to have even less than that because Jordan Mason is going to start seeing a ton of touches? Aaron Jones is a wild card for me this year. I know a lot of people really like him, but I don't think the Minnesota Vikings adding Jordan Mason is just something for us to kind of forget about either. All right, let's spend a few minutes talking about a couple of categories that show us how these running backs are being utilized inside the 20-yard line. And we're going to start with red zone carries. And Kyren Williams being here is absolutely no shock whatsoever. We talked about it at the beginning of the video. Sean McVay is a one running back type of guy. And we know when they get into the red zone, Kyren Williams is going to see a ton of touches. 70 red zone carries last season. He is a guy that is going to be utilized all over the field, not just in between the 20s, but when they get inside the red zone as well. Saquon Barkley was 61 red zone carries. We'll see how that matches up compared to goal line carries, which we'll start talking about here in just a second. But he finished 7th in rushing touchdowns. And when you take a look at everybody here inside the top, we'll say 8 guys. So inside the top 8 players, Jahmyr Gibbs, Derrick Henry, Jonathan Taylor, Joe Mixon, Josh Jacobs, Bijan Robinson, Saquon Barkley, and Kyren Williams. All of these guys also finished inside the top 10 of rushing touchdowns. The 2 that finished inside the top 10 of red zone carries, but well outside the top 10 in terms of touchdowns, was James Conner, who was 13th in rushing touchdowns with only 8. Najee Harris, who was 21st with only 6. So those guys were being utilized heavily inside the red zone, still were not able to score touchdowns. And we just talked about, obviously, with Najee Harris, his offense was a big problem. James Conner, for me, a lot of that has to do with Kyler Murray. And we got to wonder if Trey Benson is going to get more touches coming up as well. The number one, or the guys that were number 1 in rushing touchdowns, Derrick Henry and Jahmyr Gibbs, 56 and 54. A little bit of a drop off for a guy like James Cook. He was all the way down with 48 red zone carries, tied for first in rushing touchdowns, 12th in red zone carries. So he went a little bit of the opposite direction. One of the biggest fallers as well, J.K. Dobbins, 12th in touchdowns, 25th in red zone carries, not getting a ton of carries, but doing a little bit more with them when they did get into the red zone. What about some guys that we expect maybe to be utilized a little bit better? What about a guy like Tank Bigsby? So he finished 21st in red zone carries. You got to wonder if that's going to change a little bit this season, and we'll see him carry the ball a little bit more. And especially with a guy like Travis Hunter now on the field. Is him playing out of the slot, and then obviously Brian Thomas Jr. going to be a really big asset to a guy like Tank Bigsby, where when you get into the red zone, because you got a guy like Travis Hunter that's going to take a slot corner, potentially a safety or a linebacker away, if Tank Bigsby is going to find himself with maybe some more red zone carries and a few more touchdowns to go with it as well. So he is a guy that we definitely could see with a few more red zone carries. And you got to wonder, a guy like Kareem Hunt, who finished 15th in red zone carries with 43. Isaiah Pacheco, can he stay healthy for an entire season? If he does, Kareem Hunt, does he just kind of go to the wayside? A guy like Chase Brown, though, doesn't really profile as a big goal line back, but he was still heavily utilized in the red zone as well, which is another reason why, taking into account everything we've seen this offseason for where Cincinnati invested and it not really being in the running back position compared to his usage last year, Chase Brown could end up being a huge value once again this year. All right, let's take a look at goal line carries, and running backs need to take advantage of every goal line opportunity that they can possibly get. Now, do me a favor with this, though. Raise your hand down in the comments and let me know if you know this feeling I'm getting ready to describe. You're kicked back on the couch. You're enjoying your Sunday. You've got Red Zone on with our friend Scott Hansen, and they kick out to a team that is in the red zone. They're at the goal line. They're getting ready to score. Running back comes in. Your fantasy running back gets the ball, can't punch it in. Gets the ball again, can't punch it in. Gets the ball again, stopped on third down. Or they get stopped on first down and then they throw it on second down. Or they get stopped on first and then a backup running back comes in. It's always so frustrating when running backs don't take advantage of their goal line carries. But I love seeing running backs getting a ton of work on the goal line. So Josh Jacobs was number 1 this past season with 22. Chuba Hubbard, 21 carries at the goal line, number 2 this past season. Absolutely love to see that. 21 goal line carries, 10 rushing touchdowns. That bodes well for his fantasy value this year. Once again, being a very solid late round option that you're drafting is probably an RB3. And we'll see how some of the ADP kind of starts to settle down over the next couple of months when redraft leagues start. But I have to imagine Chuba Hubbard is going to be a pretty decent discount. You've got Derrick Henry and Kyren Williams tied with 20. No shock there. Jonathan Taylor, Saquon Barkley for as many goal line carries and for as many touchdowns as Jalen Hurts is taking away. Saquon Barkley is still in there. Pretty fair amount. Bijan Robinson, Jahmyr Gibbs, David Montgomery. Both of these guys had 17 goal line carries. Jahmyr Gibbs and David Montgomery. Once again in 2025, Jahmyr Gibbs is going to be a solid option for you. We'll talk more about that in just a minute. David Montgomery, I could see maybe his role being a little bit different this year. Maybe seeing Jahmyr Gibbs get a few more touches, really being that number one running back and solidifying that position. And maybe David Montgomery isn't on the field quite as much, but I still think he will be on the field more than enough to be a draft day discount. Kareem Hunt, 17 goal line carries in 2024. There's no way that continues. Can't happen. Isaiah Pacheco's got to stay healthy, though. James Cook really, for me, is kind of like the biggest riser. 11th here in goal line carries, but he was first in touchdowns. And then we've got Jahmyr Gibbs, who was 6-1. Derrick Henry, who was 3-1. So James Cook, of the guys that scored the most rushing touchdowns this season, he had the fewest goal line opportunities. Now, this is where things become a concern, is a guy like Chuba Hubbard. Okay, so he was second in goal line carries, but he was 11th in rushing touchdowns. A guy like Kareem Hunt, a little bit more concerning. 6th in goal line carries, 16th in rushing touchdowns. But then you get a guy like Joe Mixon, who was 12th in goal line carries, but he was 9th in rushing touchdowns. That's the kind of positive push that we want to see there. And then as far as a guy like J.K. Dobbins, 12th in rushing touchdowns, 25th. He had 9 rushing touchdowns this season. He had 9 goal line carries. So that was a guy that was heavily utilizing the amount of time that he was getting the ball at the goal line. But unfortunately, not much to say about him right now because he's still a free agent. All right, 4 more categories to discuss. And these are going to go a little bit quicker because they're receiving categories. We're going to take a look at targets, receptions, receiving yards, and receiving touchdowns. And we don't really need to dive too far into these statistics for every single player because not every single player is going to get a decent amount of work in the passing game. But there are guys like Alvin Kamara and Devon Achane who were 17th and 22nd, even Breece Hall, who were 18th in rushing attempts, but were 1, 2, and 3 in targets. So that's really where you have to find like that happy medium in terms of volume. Alvin Kamara, likely not the running back that we used to see at one point in time that was getting well over 350 touches per season. He was running the football and he was catching the football out of the backfield a lot. But there's still some value to be said in a guy that sees 87 targets in a season. Same thing can be said for Devon Achane, 22nd in rushing attempts, 20th in rushing yards at 907, but second in targets. So the value of Devon Achane for a guy that will likely lose out on some touches on the ground, but still giving you a decent amount of targets, is that really worthy of like a first or a second round pick? That's where you got to find that happy medium with the value. Yes, the volume in the passing game will be good. The volume in the run game could be a little bit better. Will we see an uptick on that? Because what you're looking for is a guy like Bijan Robinson, who is 4th in rushing attempts and 4th in targets. Now, that is the type of combination value that you want to find at the running back position. A guy that is going to give you top 5 in rushing attempts and top 5 in targets. That is Christian McCaffrey-like upside for his biggest seasons that he has had, where he's been far and above the number 1 overall running back and the number 1 overall player. Bijan Robinson personally should be in the conversation as the #1 pick in fantasy football drafts this season. Now the question becomes, do you look at the Arthur Smith era with Bijan Robinson and see how he was not utilized correctly? Or do you look at this new era of Bijan Robinson with a new coaching staff that obviously heavily utilized him last season and may continue to do so? The biggest part of that being that Michael Penix, when he was at quarterback, Bijan Robinson was seeing a buttload of fantasy points and opportunities. Bijan Robinson, if we see 70 targets and over 300 rushing attempts again, he'll be vying for #1 overall running back. And if you even feel like there's a little bit of a chance that Saquon Barkley is going to see a step back and he's going to regress from the numbers that he had last season, then you should seriously be considering Bijan Robinson over Saquon Barkley. I'm not telling you to do it, and I'm not telling Bijan should be over a guy like Jamar Chase either, but if you want to have that argument, you probably have a pretty darn good argument to go with it. But what about guys that were in the top 10 of rushing attempts and in targets? We just talked about Bijan, who was top 5 in both, but you've got Aaron Rodgers as well, or excuse me, Aaron Jones. Aaron Rodgers, as of this recording, isn't even on a team. Aaron Jones as well. So he finished 7th in targets and 9th in rushing attempts. Decent value further on down the line? Possibly. Depends on what Jordan Mason does. But the one thing we know about Aaron Jones is that even if he loses touches on the ground, he could still potentially be utilized out of the backfield in the passing game. Tony Pollard, 8th in rushing attempts, 8th in targets. Another solid value later on. I tell you, ladies and gentlemen, Tony Pollard is going to be one of my favorite late round draft picks this year. I can already feel it. Will he be in my must own video? It is possible. It is very possible. A guy like James Conner, top 10 in targets. Chuba Hubbard was up here. Kenneth Walker was up here as well. Chuba Hubbard, for me, is probably the one that catches me the most off guard, really, of anybody here. So seeing a guy that was 11th in rushing attempts and also being 10th in targets, that's great value. That is great value for later in your drafts as well. Tank Bigsby, let's go to the bottom of the list, only 11. Jordan Mason, that's why him and Aaron Jones may offset each other very, very well. A guy like Derrick Henry, he's not getting a whole lot of work in the passing game, but that's fine. His touchdowns and his rushing yards help bolster anything that you would miss out on there. You know, JT, Jonathan Taylor, was a guy that was heavily utilized in the passing game at one point. That era of his career is probably done, and one of the reasons why I discussed, is he worthy of being a top 12 running back? Does he need to be more in the 3rd round? Are you okay taking him in the 2nd round? Let me know down in the comments below. You know, guys like David Montgomery, he's going to get a few dump offs here and there. James Cook, not as heavily utilized in the passing game as he once was. Kyren Williams, Ramondre Stevenson, Saquon Barkley, Josh Jacobs. So a lot of these guys aren't going to have a ton of targets in the passing game, but it really doesn't offset the amount of volume that they have. Now, the one area that I would be concerned, a guy I haven't really talked about yet, is Ramondre Stevenson, because they did add TreVeyon Henderson. Now, Ramondre Stevenson had over 200 carries last year, but didn't really do anything in the passing game. So is TreVeyon Henderson really going to be that main pass catching back? And we're going to leave Ramondre Stevenson to kind of that goal line 1st and 2nd down work. If they do, then Ramondre Stevenson still has value next season, because he was never really heavily utilized in the passing game anyway. So if we're giving TreVeyon Henderson more work, it's not really like he's taking a ton from Ramondre Stevenson. So that will be something to keep an eye out when we talk about backfields that might be splitting their work. So, who did the most with the targets that they got last season? Taking a look at receptions now. Devon Achane, 2nd to 1st place. Alvin Kamara just switched spots with him. 1st to 2nd place. Bijan Robinson was 4th. He's 3rd in receptions. Everybody that was basically inside the top 10 in terms of targets last year is inside the top 10 in terms of receptions. The one that fell was Tony Pollard, who was 8th in targets, but he's 13th in receptions. Kind of the biggest riser that you see here in terms of who had the fewest amount of targets but turned him to the most receptions, that's going to be Bucky Irving, because he had 50 targets, tied for 12th last season, but he had 47 receptions, tied for 8th. So he was really your biggest riser in terms of seeing the amount of targets that he got and making the most out of them with more receptions. And as I mentioned, we're not going to spend nearly as much time here on the receiving stats as we did with a lot of the other volume stats on the ground. Talked about a few different guys when it came to targets, went a little bit quicker through receptions, and we'll go a little bit quicker through receiving yards here as well, because clearly, in terms of volume, the more targets and receptions you have, your yards are probably going to be a little bit higher. So we're going to focus on the top part of the categories here, where we're taking a look at who did the most with a little bit less. So you take a look at a guy like De'Von Achane, Alvin Kamara, Jahmyr Gibbs, these guys at the top of the list, absolutely no shock there. All of them top 10 in targets, all of them top 3 in receptions. Breece Hall's the same way. Bijan Robinson is the same way. James Conner, that might shock a few people in terms of his receiving work. He was top 10 in targets, receptions, and receiving yards. Aaron Jones, same thing. 7, 7, 7 across the board. That's a lucky number. Hey, that's jackpot there with Aaron Jones. But the guys that did a little bit more with a little bit less, that would be Bucky Irving and DeAndre Swift. Both of them tied 12th with 50 targets. And then Bucky Irving was 8th with 47 receptions. DeAndre Swift, 12th with 42 receptions. But then we bump up even a little bit more, where Bucky Irving goes to 8th with 392 receiving yards, and DeAndre Swift goes to 9th with 386 receiving yards. Now, you can look at DeAndre Swift a couple of different ways this season, and really Bucky Irving, you could say a lot for the same, okay? Because their biggest issue is the fact that they're going to have so many wide receiver weapons around them. With Bucky Irving, Mike Evans, Chris Godwin if he ends up being healthy, Jalen McMillan, newly drafted Emeka Egbuka, and then of course you're going to have K-Dot at the tight end position. When you take a look at DeAndre Swift and the Chicago Bears, Rome Odunze, DJ Moore, Cole Kmet, newly drafted Colston Loveland. So are there going to be are their targets just going to drop because they're not going to have to go to them as much? That's going to be the main issue, because if you're looking for value with a guy like DeAndre Swift, who's going a little bit later in drafts, the question becomes, does he see enough work in the passing game to kind of make up for the lack of touchdowns and the lack of efficiency on the ground? Because his volume's not all that bad on the ground, but when we talk about the efficiency video, we'll definitely see some problems there. So does he get enough work in the passing game to kind of help make up for some things? Last season he did. But is that going to continue? The same thing for Bucky Irving. Now, Bucky Irving is going way earlier than what DeAndre Swift is going. But you're looking at a guy that was top 8 in receptions and receiving yards last season. Do you really think he's going to be top 10 again in those areas? Because if he's not, that is going to hurt his ceiling. And if you're drafting him as a top 12 running back, you need to set some decent expectations. Because if you don't think these numbers are going to drop, he's definitely worthy of being a top running back draft pick. But if these numbers do drop because of the plethora of options that will be had for Tampa Bay and Baker Mayfield this year, Bucky Irving may take a little bit of a hit. And do we start looking at him more as a high-end RB2 instead of a low-end RB1? We're going to make receiving touchdowns super fast, because half of this list only had 1 or 0 receiving touchdowns last year. And part of me felt like maybe I should take these out, but I also didn't want to hurt guys like De'Von Achane, Jahmyr Gibbs, a guy like Chase Brown, who is really being looked at as another value pick again this season, a guy that you can draft as an RB2, and then even a guy like Breece Hall, who had his issues last year. Will those go back up? So those are the guys that led the list. De'Von Achane with 6, Jahmyr Gibbs and Chase Brown both tied with 4. At 3, we had Breece Hall and Rico Dowdle. And then at 2, we had several guys at 2. Alvin Kamara, Aaron Jones, Saquon Barkley, James Cook, Derrick Henry, Kyren Williams. So should I have taken receiving touchdowns out? Possibly. Yeah. Would it have really changed things all that much? With having 10 categories at this point, I really don't think it would have been a huge change to any of these guys. But I will tell you that in terms of volume, it doesn't really affect the score at the top of the list like you feel like it could at the bottom of the list. Because when you'll see here a minute with the scores, in terms of receiving touchdowns, all of the guys that finished at the bottom of the list didn't have a receiving touchdown last year. Here we go. Final category, our overall volume monster score. And again, this takes into account where everybody finished in all of these statistics. The lower the score, the better. In tier 1, it's not really shocking, but it might be a little bit. Because if you thought Saquon Barkley was going to be number 1 on this list, you are wrong. It's a guy that I talked about in the middle of this video that maybe should be considered the number 1 overall pick, Bijan Robinson, who scored 4.7. This guy, if he continues the trajectory that we saw at the end of last season, will be not only the RB1 this season, but should be the number 1 overall skill position player, taking out any quarterbacks. Bijan Robinson could absolutely have the type of season that Christian McCaffrey has had in previous years, where he was above and beyond the best running back in all of football. If Bijan Robinson continues what we saw over the last 3 games of last season, this guy is going to be an absolute stud. Jahmyr Gibbs at 5.2. Now, both of these guys finished above and beyond everybody else, because Jacobs is at 8.2, Barkley at 8.7, Derrick Henry and Kyren Williams both tied at 9.8. If you're not drafting Jahmyr Gibbs because you're worried about Johnny Morton being the new offensive coordinator, Johnny Morton was a senior offensive advisor during Ben Johnson's first season as offensive coordinator. Ben Johnson, and I think I've said this in 900 videos so far this offseason, Ben Johnson has publicly credited Johnny Morton for how he developed his game plans and even some of the trickery that he used with his game plans. Johnny Morton was a big part of Ben Johnson's development into the offensive coordinator and now head coach that he is. I don't think this offense misses a step with Johnny Morton. Josh Jacobs, it's good to see him up here. Now they've got Matthew Golden as their alpha number 1 wide receiver. Hopefully that helps Josh Jacobs a little bit. Saquon Barkley, Derrick Henry, Kyren Williams. If anyone's arguing against drafting Kyren Williams, I'd like to hear a little bit more as to why. Is it an injury concern? Do you really think the backup running backs are going to take that much value away from him? I highly doubt it. He has finished very high now consistently over the last few years in terms of volume. Kyren Williams is a guy that he's getting the rock. Over the last 2 years, he's gotten the rock consistently. Sean McVay has shown us he wants to utilize one running back, and the numbers here absolutely showing it, tying with a guy like Derrick Henry that we know is getting a ton of volume. So this first tier of running backs are the guys that are getting the most volume in terms of last season. Is it the same thing going into 2025? It might not be, and that's where we have to utilize different things to factor in that to the equation. But each of these guys saw over 300 carries last year. The only one that didn't make it inside the top tier here, that saw over 300 carries, Jonathan Taylor. We'll talk about him more here in just a moment. These guys are elite volume, and while some of them like Bijan Robinson and Jahmyr Gibbs have a lot of upside, it's the safety of Jacobs, Barkley, Henry, and Williams that if they stay healthy, you're going to be getting consistently good production with top-tier volume running backs. Now, what about Tier 2? Now, Tier 2 is a little bit bigger, and that was anyone that scored from 10.3, which was James Conner, down to 14.8, which was James Cook. So James Conner, I think people might be a little bit shocked to see a guy like James Conner and Chase Brown so high on this list. Now, the one thing that the top tier of players had in common is that combined they missed 2 games. This tier here, we start to see more games missed, which obviously makes a whole lot of sense. Now, at the top, James Conner and Chase Brown, they each missed 1 game. Both of these guys, if they don't miss that game, do they make it into the top tier here? Potentially. Maybe not. It depends. Will James Conner see the same type of volume this year? That's a big question with Trey Benson being in year 2. Will Chase Brown see the same volume? Chase Brown doesn't really have a guy behind him that's going to cause an issue for volume because Zach Moss and Samaje Perine are really not that big of a concern. But the biggest thing with Chase Brown is will they run the ball enough knowing that their defense isn't going to be all that great and they're going to have to throw the ball an awful lot. Chase Brown still, for me, I think will see a decent amount of volume. He only had 229 carries last year, which was 16th. And that was because, he wasn't the guy at the beginning of the season. And then he was as the year went on. Now, he could be the guy all season long, and if he sees 230 carries again, then there's no reason why they can't be a super safe bet like we see here. Aaron Jones, I would believe that Aaron Jones is probably going to take a tumble this year with Jordan Mason being a part of the equation now. Chuba Hubbard, I think seeing Chuba Hubbard in this area is a really good feeling for those of you that want to invest in him as an RB3. I don't know if I'm willing to go RB2 yet. Devon Achane, for being a guy that's considered a top 5 running back pick, and a first-round pick, he's a little low on this list for me. Could the volume on the ground go up a little bit, which would obviously cause him to rise? Absolutely. But I also don't think they're going to give Devon Achane 250 carries in a season. Now, Achane last season missed 3 games. Alvin Kamara, same thing in this same area. He missed 3 games. Jonathan Taylor, he missed 3 games. So Jonathan Taylor, even though he missed 3 games, he was still top 10 in volume. So they were feeding him the rock in the games that he was healthy. It was just efficiency and some other things to go along with it that caused him to score a lot lower. You look at a guy like James Cook. James Cook's kind of claim to fame last year was his touchdown. 16 rushing touchdowns, which had him at number 1 overall, tied at number 1. But he was 19th in rushing attempts, 16th in rushing yards, 21st in avoided tackles, 12th in red zone carries, 11th at the goal line, 21st in targets, 23 in receptions, 18 in receiving yards, 6th in receiving touchdowns with just 2. He was tied for 6th. If you're taking a look at James Cook, he definitely could be a little bit of a roller coaster like he was at last season. If he scores a touchdown, that's awesome. But he didn't really see the amount of volume that you would need to feel really good about his performance if he didn't score a touchdown. So that's going to be the biggest question for basically anybody in this group this year. James Cook, can he replicate those touchdowns? So again, James Conner, Chase Brown, like where they're at. Aaron Jones, probably going to drop after this coming season. Chuba Hubbard, I like him. Some competition for touches, but not enough that I'm overly concerned about. Devon Achane could see a little bit of an increase in terms of his volume on the ground, but really his claim to fame is going to be his receiving work right now. And do you think that that is enough, given the information on screen, to make him a top 5 running back pick? Alvin Kamara, not the guy that he used to be, but in PPR leagues and half PPR leagues as a running back too, could still do just enough. Joe Mixon, you take a look at what he did. He was a guy that he started off last season very fast and was very good. And unfortunately, as there were injuries at the wide receiver position and on the offensive line, and how bad the offensive line was last year, he went downhill and he went downhill fast. So that's really where that's going to lie. Bucky Irving being in this second group after really not being the guy for quite a bit to start the year really speaks to how much they liked him down the stretch and that he should be the guy once again. We need to see some of that volume pop up on the ground though, because he's probably going to lose some through the air. Najee Harris, you got to expect that his volume is going to come down. He's going to split touches with Amari and Hampton. Jonathan Taylor, James Cook, talked about both of these guys already. One thing that I found very interesting as we talk about the third tier here is the fact that if it weren't for Kenneth Walker, this tier would have missed significantly less games than what the tier above them did. However, the tier above them scored better. Is there any reason why? Now, Breece Hall, you have to hope that he is going to see more volume and better volume in 2025. But I mentioned this in my rankings video talking about Breece Hall. Braylon Allen looked pretty darn good at times last season, and he's still very young. Aaron Glenn is coming from an offensive system where they utilize 2 running backs. Will they do that with Braylon Allen and Breece Hall more often? And if they do, can Breece Hall get himself to 250 carries and keep about the same amount of work in the receiving game? If he can, then he's a guy that can give us RB2 value. And if the efficiency is better, then we're talking about a guy that could make his way back into the top 12. But there's some question marks there. David Montgomery, solid all season long, ended up missing 3 games. If it hadn't been for those 3 games, he would have been over 200 carries once again, probably would have scored another touchdown or 2. So he's going to be another guy that you're probably going to be able to draft as your RB3 this year. DeAndre Swift, I don't expect him to get all that better in terms of volume. I just don't see a path to volume where DeAndre Swift is consistently getting the football in Ben Johnson's offense. Kenneth Walker, his biggest issue is that he missed 6 games. And this is one of those names that we'll definitely be taking a look at when we do the efficiency video, because even though his volume wasn't all that great, these guys toward the bottom of the list, how good were they efficiency-wise? Because if they were very good, if they can stay healthy, then they're guys that have a ton of upside. Tony Pollard, pretty low in terms of volume, but that's okay because I'm not looking for him to be an RB1. I'm looking for him to give me really solid RB2 production as an RB3 drafted. Rico Dowdle, I really don't see him keeping things up now that he's in Carolina. He's going to be one of those competitions with Chuba Hubbard for touches, but I don't think it's going to be a ton of competition. Ramondre Stevenson already wasn't seeing a ton of volume last year, so you have to anticipate that if TreVeyon Henderson takes half of the volume that Stevenson saw, that Stevenson becomes irrelevant. Now, if Stevenson sees the same amount of volume plus maybe a few more carries, he might be okay because he didn't do all that much in the passing game. And if he were to finish right in this area, he's not going to give us some RB1 performances that we used to see, but his upside could be mid to low end RB2. And then Tyrone Tracy, not a ton of volume last year, wasn't a guy that was the guy to begin with. Definitely missed some time, not in terms of like overall games because he missed 0 games last season, but he did have an issue with like getting banged up and coming off of the field. That is what I meant by missed touches. And then obviously some fumble issues that he's going to have to take care of, because if he doesn't, Cam Scatabo is going to be waiting for him. All right, let's wrap things up here at the bottom of the list. And these are the guys that missed the most games last season. 4 for Kareem Hunt, 4 for J.K. Dobbins, 3 for Brian Robinson, only 2 for Tank Bigsby, and 5 for Jordan Mason. So their volume across the board is not going to look all that great, and that's why they are so low. These are the guys that we're really going to be focusing on when it comes to the efficiency video. Now, Kareem Hunt is back in Kansas City. They've got some additional running backs in the room with him, and Isaiah Pacheco should end up being healthy, so he's not a guy that I'm really too focused on right now. As of right now, not really focused on J.K. Dobbins either. Brian Robinson, Tank Bigsby, and Jordan Mason at the bottom of this video are guys that I'm going to want to pay attention to in the efficiency video. And part of the reason why is they all finished very low here in terms of just overall volume. Brian Robinson missed 3 games. He's still going to have Austin Eckler with him, and now you've added Deebo Samuel. So he's going to have to be way more efficient. And if he is more efficient than what he is looking at a volume, that's not all that worrisome for a guy that, again, we could draft a little bit later. Tank Bigsby for me is one of the bigger ones at this point, though, because Travis Etienne is not going to go anywhere. But is Tank Bigsby good enough efficiency-wise to basically knock back Travis Etienne another step and start seeing more touches? That's a big question mark. Same thing goes for Jordan Mason. Volume, not great. He missed 5 games. But is the efficiency good enough for him that when he starts splitting a backfield with Aaron Jones, that his efficiency is better than Aaron Jones, so he can start taking that job away a little bit more often as well. But who were the biggest risers from 2023 to 2024? Big shout out to Taylor here because he put this information together for me, and it's the first time that I've actually gotten the information from one video to another to see what the change was for the running backs that were in both videos. So big shout out to Taylor for getting me this information. The biggest change last season was Bijan Robinson, who was 12.2 in 2023, but saw his score go all the way down to 4.7, a change of 7.5. Josh Jacobs went from 14.1 to 8.2. James Conner, 15.4 to 10.3. Chuba Hubbard, 14.5 to 11.3. Saquon Barkley, not a big turnaround here, 10.7 to 8.7. Derrick Henry, 11.4 to 9.8. Then we start to get into the negatives a little bit. So Kyren Williams saw a little bit of a drop. Not much and not enough to be concerned about. Najee Harris saw a pretty decent drop. Also could see another significant drop having Omari and Hampton. James Cook, I already talked about it, right? He was fueled by touchdowns. But when you take a look at where he ranked with everybody else in terms of overall volume over the last couple of years, he saw a drop. His score went from 11.7 all the way up to 14.8, a change of negative 3.1. David Montgomery saw a little bit of a drop as well. Jahmyr Gibbs being much better this year than he was the previous year and really breaking out and having that huge high upside number one potential. Missing 3 games did it as well. Kenneth Walker saw a pretty significant change, and that was because of 5 games missed. DeAndre Swift, for as much volume as he saw the year before, his volume last season wasn't all that great, but he went from Philadelphia to Chicago, so that makes sense. Breece Hall is a big one. And again, I've already mentioned it this offseason. Breece Hall was probably my biggest miss of last season. And part of the reason is why right here. Joe Mixon, even though he saw a pretty huge change in terms of his overall volume, he was a little bit better in terms of efficiency last year, something that we hadn't seen. And then Tony Pollard going from the volume that he had in Dallas to the volume that he had in Tennessee was obviously going to be a huge change. Headliner Nation, let's do a giveaway. Because y'all have been slacking, so clearly I need to incentivize everybody today. Because this offseason, our best video in terms of likes is only 724. And we've got some videos with 10,000 and more views. Headliner Nation, I need y'all to help us out. The like button does a ton of things for this channel, and it's free and it's easy. It's literally a thumbs up that you click on right below the video. But first off, it lets us know that you appreciate the content that you're getting in that video. But number 2, it helps us in YouTube. It helps us with sponsors. It helps us with ad revenue. It helps us with being broadcast out on YouTube a little bit more, which also helps with a lot of different things. So if you're watching these videos on a religious basis, please start to be more consistent by hitting the like button. So in today's video, if we can get 750 likes, which would be the most in a video this offseason, anybody who likes this video, subscribes to the channel, and leaves a comment down below with hashtag Let's Get It, you're going to be entered for a chance to win a free draft guide. And when this video hits 750 likes, I will pick somebody from the comments that liked the video, subscribed, and obviously left a comment. And in my next video, well, not my next one because that would be tomorrow, but in my video next week, I'll announce the winner. Headliner Nation, appreciate all that you guys do. Appreciate you being here during the off season and watching all the content. Make sure you get in it for a free draft guide in this video. I'll see y'all later though. Stay safe, stay healthy, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Fantasy Headliners.